The most important part of education is right training in the nursery. The soul of the child in his play should be guided to the love of that sort of excellence in which, when he grows up to manhood, he'll have to be perfected. Hi, I'm Scott Postma for Kepler Education, and this quote is the advice Plato gives about the education of a child in his last and most mature dialogue, The Laws. After a lifetime of writing, teaching, and philosophizing, and several attempts at training rulers to cultivate ethical, political, and judicial systems, he records his best and most mature thoughts in this fascinating but often overlooked dialogue. In this particular work, an unnamed Athenian stranger, one that's not unlike Socrates, joins a couple of other old men on a pilgrimage from Knossos to Zeus's cave, a sort of play on Minos' journey. And as they travel towards the cave, they pass the time making laws for a new city that they call the city of Magnetes or Magnesia. The dialogue opens with the protagonist asking a question. Tell me, strangers, is a god or some man supposed to be the author of your laws? Now, this question in and of itself is worth contemplation, but after some discussion on the nature of the laws, the conversation naturally moves to discussing education. And the stranger gives his perspective. He says, anyone who would be good at anything must practice that thing from his youth upwards, both in sport and earnest. For example, he who would be a good builder should play at building children's houses, and he who is to be a good husbandman at tilling the ground. And those who have the care of children's education should provide the young with mimic tools, that is, toys that allow them to imitate the vocation for which they show the greatest proclivities. They should learn beforehand the knowledge which they shall afterwards, will afterwards require for their art. As an example, the future carpenter should learn how to measure or apply the line in play, and the future warrior should learn riding or some other exercise for amusement, and the teacher should endeavor to direct the children's inclinations and pleasures by the help of amusements, all toward that final aim in life. And so Plato's first observation is one that's really been proven experientially for the last 3,000 years of recorded history. The most important part of education is right training in the nursery, because children who start learning an art or a skill at a young age become the best at that skill and often pursue it as a vocation when they grow up. One area where this concept is most obvious today is in the sports arena or the orchestra pit. Wayne Gretzky, Tiger Woods, and Kobe Bryant all began playing their respective sport when they were just 3 years old. Franz Liszt began composing at age 6, and Chopin was giving public concerts at 7, and Mozart began consistently and formally playing the piano at age 3. But this is not the full extent of what Plato's philosopher is actually saying, and it's definitely not the most important thing either. From this point, the Athenian philosopher continues. He says, then let us not leave the meaning of education ambiguous or ill-defined. At present, when we speak in terms of praise or blame about the bringing up of each person, we call one man educated and another uneducated. Although the uneducated man may be sometimes very well educated for the calling of a retail trader or of the captain of a ship and the like. In other words, he's saying one can be skilled in a craft or a trade without actually being an educated person. He goes on and says, for we're not speaking of education in this narrower sense, in the sense of craft or trade, but of that other education in virtue from youth upwards, which makes a man eagerly pursue the ideal perfection of citizenship and teaches him how rightly to rule and how to obey. This, Plato says, is the only education which, upon our view, deserves the name education. That other sort of training, which aims at the acquisition of wealth or bodily strength or mere cleverness, apart from intelligence and justice, is mean and illiberal and is not worthy to be called an education at all. Finally, he says, let us not quarrel with one another about a word, provided that the proposition which has just been granted hold good. To wit, that those who are rightly educated generally become good men. Neither must we cast a slight upon education, which is the first and fairest thing that the best of men can ever have, and which, though liable to take a wrong direction, is capable of reformation. And this work of reformation is the great business of every man while he lives. So there are really two takeaways that I'd like to draw from what has been said. The first is that for nearly 3,000 years of recorded history, educators have understood that the best way to educate a child is to begin in the nursery, as Plato puts it. Let children interact through play and through mimicking, he says, and by their play, parents will both discover and can cultivate those natural endowments toward which their proclivities will likely lead them in the direction of their life's vocation. But the second important takeaway is in the way in which Plato makes a very clear distinction between those arts that he calls illiberal and those arts which he calls liberal. While it's good to teach children by letting them play, that is not a substitute for a liberal education. Yet, in the same way that they learn their vocation, they also learn how to be virtuous by playing virtuous scenarios, by reading good literature, and by hearing and learning the stories that teach virtue. The very best way to educate a child is to start when they're as young as possible. And when it comes to a liberal arts education, we can start by reading them virtuous stories, stories that they can act out, stories that cultivate their imagination. But above all, let us model virtue. Teach them what virtue looks like and teach them both how to obey and how to rule. Oh, and if you didn't start when they were in the nursery, the second best time to start educating your children liberally is today.